I want to begin by saying that I have lived on 11 different worlds. I have stood in the corrosive rain of the Gel marshes. I have watched a Vorakan warship break atmosphere over Pendris colony during the Third Expansion War. I have seen things that most beings in this galaxy consider genuinely terrifying. I am telling you this because I want you to understand that when I say what happened in Classroom 7 Delta on the 14th cycle scared me, and not in the way I expected, I am not speaking lightly. I want you to understand exactly what kind of scared I mean. Not the scared you feel when a weapon is pointed at you. Not the cold, logical fear you feel when you calculate that you are in physical danger and your body starts preparing to run or fight. That kind of scared I know well. Most beings in this galaxy do. This was different. This was the scared you feel when you suddenly realize that the thing sitting next to you in the dark is not what you thought it was. When the shape you assumed was furniture moves. When you understand, too late, always too late, that you were the least dangerous thing in the room the entire time. That kind of scared. Let me start from the beginning. Section 1. The Station and the Program. Vareth 9 is not a glamorous place. Anyone who has been there knows this. It orbits a dim, unhappy star in the outer rim of the Consortium's academic network, and the reason it was chosen for the Interspecies Integration Program, the IIP as we called it, was mostly bureaucratic. It had space. It had classrooms that weren't already allocated. It had life support systems that could be reconfigured for 17 different atmospheric compositions, which mattered because the IIP brought together students from 17 different species. The program itself was new, 3 years old at the time of the incident. The idea was that consortium member species should attempt to educate their younger generations together, to build, as the promotional material said with that particular brand of optimism that bureaucrats seem to manufacture in unlimited quantities, bridges of understanding across the stars. I believed in it, I still do. But I want to be clear that in practice, Vareth 9 in those years was awkward and uncomfortable and full of the kind of low-grade tension that comes from putting beings together who don't understand each other and expecting understanding to happen automatically. It doesn't work like that. I know that now better than I did then. There were about 200 students in the program, 40-something species represented, though most had only 1 or 2 individuals attending. The majority of the student body was Chelhari, Drameth, Velkai, and Sauron, the big 4 consortium species, the ones with the most established academic infrastructure, the ones whose governments had been most enthusiastic about the program at the political level. And then there were 6 humans. 6. That number matters, remember it. The consortium had been in formal contact with humanity for 11 years at that point. 11 years is not a long time in galactic political terms. Most species have centuries of integration history before they start sending students to multi-species academic programs. Humanity had 11 years and 6 students, and the collective nervous curiosity of an entire galactic civilization watching to see what they were going to do. There was a lot of documentation produced about humans in those years. I read most of it because I was studying xenolinguistics and human communication patterns were part of my coursework. The documentation was comprehensive and frequently contradictory. Humans were simultaneously described as the most cooperative species ever cataloged and the most violently territorial. They were noted to produce art of staggering complexity and also to find joy in activities that most consortium species would classify as survival emergencies. One document I read, I believe it was a Drameth intelligence assessment, though it had been declassified by the time it reached our curriculum, described humanity's home planet in terms that I still think about. It listed the planetary conditions, the atmospheric composition that was technically survivable but dense with biological hazards, the gravitational index that was higher than consortium standard, The temperature variance across the surface that ranged from what the document called lethally cold to lethally hot, depending on location and season. The quantity and variety of predatory organisms that occupied every ecological niche on the planet. The frequency of geological events that could reshape entire coastlines. The electromagnetic storms that could disable technology across continental distances. Then the document said something that I have thought about many times since the incident in classroom 7 Delta. It said, the human species emerged from this environment not merely adapted to survive it, but apparently thriving. They did not escape their planet's dangers. They cataloged them, studied them, climbed them for recreational purposes, and in several documented cases, kept the smaller ones as companions. We recommend updating our threat assessment classifications accordingly. I remember reading that and thinking it was probably bureaucratic hyperbole. Intelligence assessments tend toward drama. I don't think that anymore. Section 2, Classroom 7 Delta. The course was Interspecies Communication Theory. It was a required class for all first-year IIP students, which meant it was one of the few places where the whole mixed cohort sat together regularly. 40 students from 9 different species, all squeezed into a room designed for 30, learning how to talk to each other from a professor who, bless him, genuinely believed that if you explained communication theory clearly enough, communication would improve automatically. Professor Yenvath was Velkai, old in the way that Velkai get old. He developed the particular translucence in his outer membrane that indicates advanced age for his species, so you could faintly see his internal structure if the light hit him right. He was kind. He was patient. He was utterly unprepared for what happened in his classroom on the 14th cycle. He was also, I want to say clearly, not at fault for any of it. The humans sat in the back row. Not because anyone told them to. It was just where they'd ended up over the first few weeks, gradually migrating there the way certain species gravitate toward the back of shared spaces. I'd noticed it but hadn't thought much about it. It wasn't unusual for species cohorts to cluster in the early weeks of integration programs. People feel safer near others who smell familiar, who move in ways they recognize, who breathe at the same rhythm. The 6 humans were a woman named Priya, who studied computational linguistics and had a habit of writing in 3 notebooks simultaneously. A man named Tors, who was studying conflict mediation and seemed personally offended by any conflict he witnessed. A person named Kale. Human gender categories were not something I fully understood at that point, who was studying xenobiology and kept a small terrarium of Earth organisms in their quarters that other students had reported finding deeply unsettling. A man named Brecht who barely spoke in class but whose written work, when I was assigned to collaborative projects with him, was extraordinary. A woman named Sun Lee, who studied diplomatic theory and had a laugh that could be heard 3 corridors away, and a woman named Maren Solstad. Maren is the center of this account. I want to take a moment here to describe her the way I perceived her in those early weeks before the incident, because I think it's important for understanding what happened. What I thought I was seeing and what I was actually seeing turned out to be very different things. Maren Solstad was, by human standards that I've since become more familiar with, unremarkable in appearance. Medium height for a human female. Pale skin. She came from a northern region of Earth, I later learned, a place called Norway, which is apparently very cold and dark for much of the year. Hair that was somewhere between brown and blonde depending on the lighting. She wore it pulled back most of the time. Her eyes were a color that I later learned humans call gray-green, which seems like an indecisive color, though I've come to understand that humans describe a remarkable number of things in compound terms, because they notice distinctions that other species smooth over. She was quiet. That was my primary impression of her. She sat in the back row and she listened and she took notes and she rarely volunteered answers in class. When she did speak, she spoke carefully, like someone selecting words from a limited supply. She wasn't cold. She smiled easily when you made eye contact with her, and she always acknowledged other students when they passed in the corridor. But she was contained in a way that made her easy to underestimate. Which I understand now was not an accident. Section 3. Kareth 7 and the Architecture of Arrogance. Kareth 7 was Drameth. I want to be careful about how I characterize this, because I have Drameth friends and colleagues, and I do not want this account to read as species criticism. The Drameth are a proud species with a long and genuinely distinguished history in the consortium. Their academic traditions are ancient. Their contributions to galactic science, philosophy, and governance are real and substantial. But the Drameth also have a particular cultural architecture around status. This is documented. It's not controversial to say it. Their social structures are hierarchical in ways that run deeper than politics or economics. They run into neurology, into how Drameth brains literally process the world. Drameth perceive status before they perceive much else. They can read a social hierarchy in a room within moments of entering it, assigning themselves and everyone else a rank almost unconsciously, and they relate to everyone according to that rank. The problem with the IIP, from a Drameth perspective, was that multi-species social hierarchies are genuinely hard to read. Who ranks above whom when the species themselves are of varying galactic seniority? When some species have been in the consortium for centuries and others for decades? When some arrived with elaborate diplomatic credentials and others arrived as a handful of nervous students in an experimental program? Most Drameth students navigated this by defaulting to consortium seniority, ranking themselves according to their species' long membership history, which placed them comfortably above the newer additions. Humans, with their 11 years, sat at the very bottom of that calculation. Kareth 7 had arrived at Vareth 9 with the particular confidence of a being who had always been near the top of every hierarchy he'd inhabited. He was from a wealthy Drameth family with deep political connections. He was smart. I want to say that clearly because it matters. He wasn't threatening people because he was stupid or insecure in some obvious way. He was threatening people because, in his experience, being at the top of hierarchies was simply the natural order of things, and any deviation from that order was a problem to be corrected. He'd had minor incidents with several students before the Marin situation. Nothing that had risen to the level of formal complaints, mostly comments, dismissals, the particular kind of contempt that stops just short of actionable behavior, because it's been calibrated precisely to that edge. He'd made a Velkai student cry in their first week by commenting on the declining cultural relevance of Velkai academic traditions. He'd caused a Soren student to leave the cafeteria 3 times by positioning himself in their space. Soren have very specific territory responses, and Kareth knew it. He understood exactly what he was doing. That was the part that made it ugly. He'd tested most of the human students by the time the incident occurred. Not dramatically, small things. Comments about humanity's brief consortium membership. Observations about human primitive world origins framed as academic curiosity. Questions designed to expose ignorance, delivered with the academic precision of someone who knows exactly which gaps to probe. Tors had responded with a long, measured speech about the value of diverse perspectives that had seemed to bore Kareth. Priya had buried him in linguistic data until he withdrew. Sun Li had laughed, which seemed to confuse him. Brecht had simply looked at him with an expression I can only describe as deeply uninterested, which had also seemed to confuse him. Kale had offered to show him photographs from their terrarium, which had ended the interaction immediately. Marin had not responded at all, the first few times. She'd simply looked at him with those gray-green eyes and waited until he was done talking, and then returned to whatever she was doing. That, I think, is what made him escalate. There is something that hierarchically oriented beings find uniquely disturbing about non-response. Indifference reads as a challenge, even when, especially when, it's genuinely indifferent. If you don't react to someone's attempt to establish dominance, you're implicitly refusing to participate in the hierarchy they're trying to construct. And for Karath 7, having someone, a human, at the bottom of every seniority calculation he'd ever made, simply not respond to him was apparently intolerable. Section 4, the 14th cycle. The day it happened was ordinary up until it wasn't. Classroom 7 Delta had been reconfigured twice that week to accommodate a visiting Gorath student. Gorath needs specific atmospheric conditions and spatial arrangements, and the reconfiguration always left the room slightly off. The lighting was too warm. The seating had been rearranged and not quite put back right. It felt like a room that was still settling back into its shape. Professor Yenvath was running about 10 minutes late because of a faculty meeting that had gone long. So we had 40 students sitting in a room together without supervision, waiting, which is always fertile ground for whatever social dynamics are running under the surface. I was sitting in the third row. I was talking to a Saurin classmate, Vel Thin, a pleasant person who was doing fascinating research on chromatic communication systems, when I became aware of raised voices at the back of the room. Not loud at first, not dramatic, just elevated, the kind of elevation that makes your attention pull toward it even when you don't want it to. I turned. Karath 7 was standing at the end of the back row. He was in full display posture, the Drameth equivalent of squaring up, though it involves their crest structure rather than their shoulders. His crest was high and fanned out, which in Drameth signaling indicates aggression or dominance assertion. The yellow in his skin chromatophores had intensified, which is another aggression marker. He was looking at Marin. Marin was sitting in her seat. She had not stood up. Her notebook was closed in front of her. She'd been writing when I first noticed them and she'd stopped. But she hadn't stood. She was just sitting there looking up at him with that expression I'd noticed before. Calm, watchful, waiting. I should explain what Drameth looked like, for the record, because it matters for understanding the visual dynamics of that moment. Drameth are large. They average about 2 meters in height, and they're broad through the torso, with that crest structure that adds another 15 to 20 centimeters when it's fully elevated. They're physically imposing by almost any species standards. Their skin is a warm amber brown at baseline, shifting toward yellow or gold when they're agitated, and they have 4 upper limbs, 2 primary arms and 2 secondary arms that are smaller but fully articulated, used mainly for fine manipulation. Karath was in full aggressive display, and he was probably 2.5 times Marin's mass. Marin had not stood up. I remember thinking in that first moment of seeing the scene, this could be a problem. Someone should probably intervene. I started to stand. I stopped. I stopped because of what I heard. Section 5, what he said. I'm going to reproduce this as accurately as I can. I've thought about it many times since. I've talked to other students who were present and compared notes. I believe this is essentially accurate, though the exact phrasing of the early part of the exchange is reconstructed. I caught the last part of it but had missed the beginning. What I heard Karath saying, as I turned and saw the scene, was this. And I want you to understand that I am not speculating. I have family in the Consortium Trade Council. I can make certain that your species' academic access status is reviewed. Do you understand what I'm saying? I can ensure that the next cohort of humans admitted to this program is the last. I can ensure that you personally are flagged as socially inadaptive for the integration records, which will follow you everywhere in consortium space. I am telling you what I can do. I am giving you the opportunity to respond appropriately before I decide whether to do it. He paused. He said, you should look afraid. He said it simply, not like a dramatic villain in a story, like someone making a practical observation. Like someone explaining to a child that a hot surface will burn them. You should look afraid. The room had gone very quiet while he spoke. The kind of quiet that happens when 40 students from 9 species all realize simultaneously that something has shifted, and none of them are sure what to do. I could hear the environmental system cycling. I could hear the very faint sound of Velthin's chromatic patterns shifting beside me in distress. Soren expressed anxiety through involuntary color changes. I could hear my own breathing. And then Maren Solstead smiled. Section 6. The Smile. I want to try to describe this accurately, because it is the crux of everything. It was not a warm smile. It was not a cold smile. Those are categories I reach for because they're available, but they don't quite fit. Have you ever seen a very old predator? I have. The Chelhari hunt on certain worlds, and I spent time on Yeskar 3 where the apex predators have had millions of years to settle into what they are. There is a quality that very old, very effective predators have. A kind of self-possession. A kind of radical completeness. They don't need to threaten because they have never in their evolutionary history needed to signal threat to protect themselves. Everything in their environment learned long ago what they were and made appropriate decisions. The smile was like that. It started slowly. It reached her eyes. That's the thing I keep coming back to. The smile reached her eyes, which is technically a sign of genuine positive emotion in humans, I've since learned. Genuine smiles involve the orbital muscles around the eyes. Performed smiles don't. So the smile was genuine. That was the first thing that didn't make sense to me, watching it happen. He had just threatened her career, her species' academic future, her entire standing in consortium space. And she was genuinely, authentically, from the inside out pleased. She looked the way you look when someone hands you exactly the thing you needed. She said, okay. Not okay, I'll be afraid. Not okay, I'll comply, just okay. She said it like someone agreeing to the next item on a list. Kareth's crest flickered. It was a tiny movement, involuntary. I'm certain of that because I've watched the recording from the room's documentation system many times since, and it happens too fast to be deliberate. His crest dropped about 3 centimeters and then went back up. The yellow in his chromatophore spiked and then, for just a moment, went dull. That's a Dromath stress response. Not anger, not aggression, surprise tipping toward alarm. In something like a quarter of a second, Maren Solstead had made a being 2.5 times her size feel uncertain. She hadn't moved. She was still sitting down. She hadn't changed her posture, hadn't raised her voice, hadn't done anything that registers in any threat display catalog I know of for any species. She just smiled and said okay. Then she said something else. Section 7. What she said. She said, I want to make sure I understand what you're describing. You're saying that you have social and political connections that could be used to limit my species' access to consortium academic programs. And you're saying this to me as, and here she paused and tilted her head very slightly, and I could see her selecting her words the way she always did, carefully from that limited supply, as what? A warning, a negotiating position, an invitation. Her voice was normal, not loud, not soft, not shaking. The kind of voice that a person uses when they're having an ordinary conversation about the weather or the cafeteria schedule. Kareth said, a warning, you are in consortium space. You operate under consortium academic rules. You have been here for 11 years. We have been here for 1100. When I say I have reach, I mean I have reach. I am giving you information that I suggest you consider carefully. Maren nodded slowly. Okay, she said again. Then let me make sure you have information too. She finally stood up. I want to note this because the room noticed it too. I could feel the collective attention shift. She was entirely unhurried about it. She stood the way someone stands when they've decided to stand, not because anything is urgent, but because standing is the appropriate thing for this moment. She put her notebook to the side. She straightened her jacket. She looked up at Karath 7, who was still significantly larger than her in every measurable dimension. She looked genuinely interested, engaged, the way a person looks when they've encountered a puzzle that they find pleasantly challenging. "You know what I think is interesting," she said, "the framing of that. We've been here for 1100 years, you've been here for 11. Like." And here something flickered through her expression that I now understand was suppressed amusement. "Like the duration of consortium membership is the variable we should both be focused on." She said, "Can I tell you about where I'm from?" Kareth said nothing. He was watching her. The yellow in his chromatophores had done that odd thing again, spiked and then dimmed, like a signal trying to decide what it was. She said, "I'm from Norway. It's in the northern part of a continent on Earth. You know about Earth. You've clearly read the academic literature on human home-world conditions, so you know the basics. Dense atmosphere, variable climate, significant predation pressure, geological instability." She said it the way you describe a pleasant vacation destination. "But here's what I think the literature maybe doesn't capture well," she continued, "because it's hard to capture in documentation, the specifics, the texture of it, because Norway, where I grew up, Norway is cold. And I don't mean consortium cold or outer rim cold or whatever cold means to you. I mean in winter, the temperature goes low enough that your breath freezes when it leaves your body. Low enough that, if you fall into the ocean, you have roughly 10 minutes before your body stops being able to generate enough heat to keep your heart going." She paused. "We have a word for it, we call it bitterness. The cold being bitter. Isn't that interesting? We assign an emotional quality to a temperature." She was looking at Kareth with those gray-green eyes. He had not moved. The room had not moved. "And in the dark, because in winter in Norway, the sun doesn't rise some days, or when it does, it's for maybe 4 hours, and the light is this low sideways light that doesn't really illuminate anything. It just makes long shadows. In that dark there are things. There were things when we were developing as a species. The evolutionary history of my region includes large predators that were adapted specifically to hunt in that dark, in that cold, in the specific conditions that humans find most impaired." She said, "We're not impaired anymore. We have technology. We have warm buildings and artificial light and weapon systems that would have seemed divine to my ancestors. But we grew up in that. We grew up being the thing that was hunted in the dark and the cold, and she paused again, and this pause felt different, felt deliberate, felt like she was choosing to do something. We didn't die out. We're here. We're talking to you in your academic station 11 years into consortium membership." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm not afraid of you," she said. "I want to be clear about that, because you asked me to look afraid and I'm not going to perform an emotion for your benefit. But I also want to be clear that it's not bravado. It's not stubbornness. It's not even that I've made a calculation about how dangerous you actually are. It's something simpler than that." She said, "I come from a place where things that wanted to be the most dangerous thing in the room were usually not the most dangerous thing in the room, where the thing that announced itself was usually the thing you didn't need to worry about, where you learned early that the scariest things don't tell you they're scary. They just—" and here she made a small, economical gesture with one hand, a kind of opening and closing, "show you." She stopped talking. The room was very, very quiet. And then, and this is the part that I have never been able to fully explain, that I have turned over in my mind many times, that I have discussed with xenopsychologists and behavioral analysts and communication theorists. Then she smiled again. The same smile as before, genuine, reaching her eyes, the smile of someone who has received exactly the thing they needed. And she sat back down, opened her notebook and began writing. Section 8, Aftermath Immediate. For a moment that felt long. I've been told it was approximately 8 seconds from the documentation timestamp. Kareth 7 stood there. Then Professor Yenvath came in. He was slightly flushed from hurrying, apologizing for his lateness, not immediately aware of the atmosphere in the room. He began setting up his materials. He had a lecture on paralinguistic communication scheduled for that day, nonverbal signals, the communication that happens below and around language. I remember thinking that the universe has a particular dark sense of humor. Karath 7 sat down. He sat down in the seat nearest to him, which happened to be in the middle of the room rather than his usual position. He sat for the first 15 minutes of the lecture without moving in the particular careful way that someone sits when they're trying not to attract attention. At the 20-minute mark, he raised his hand and told Professor Yenvath he was unwell and left the room. I watched him leave. I watched the door close behind him. Then I looked back at the back row. Marin was writing in her notebook. She had been writing since she sat back down. She didn't look up when Karath left. She didn't look around the room to check reactions. She just wrote. Tors, sitting next to her, was watching the door close with the expression of someone who has just witnessed a close call and can't quite believe it resolved the way it did. He caught my eye across the room and made a small motion with his head that I interpreted as something like "see what I mean." Priya, on Marin's other side, was also writing, but when I looked at her, she caught my eye and did something with her expression that I couldn't read at the time. I've since asked her what she was thinking in that moment. She said she was trying not to laugh. Section 9. The conversations after. I want to include several accounts here from other students who were present, because I don't think my perspective alone is sufficient to convey what happened. Testimony V.L. Elthan, SORREN species, first-year student. Submitted voluntarily to the Archival Bureau, Verath 9, 2 months after the incident. I process emotional information partly through color. I can't always control it. The chromatic response is involuntary when emotional signals are intense. I mention this because I was apparently visibly distressed during the early part of the interaction, before Marin began speaking, and several people noticed. What I want to explain is what I perceived from Karath 7 versus what I perceived from Marin. With Karath, I was picking up aggression markers. I'm sensitive to those. It's partly a Soren thing. We evolved in environments where reading predatory intent was survival critical. His posture, his chromatophore patterns, his vocal register, all of that was registering to me as active threat. My involuntary response was appropriate to that input. When Marin stood up and began speaking, I waited for similar signals from her. They didn't come, which confused me initially because the scene clearly involved conflict and confrontation, and both participants were engaged. So why was one generating threat signals and one wasn't? I've thought about this a lot since. I've talked to a xenopsychologist who works with human behavioral patterns, and what I think now is this. Marin wasn't generating threat signals because she wasn't in a threat state. She was genuinely calm. She was genuinely, and this is the part that I found unsettling when I understood it, interested. Like the situation was engaging to her rather than alarming. The xenopsychologist told me that this is consistent with documented patterns in humans who come from high-difficulty environments. They develop very high stress thresholds. Things that would trigger strong fight-or-flight responses in other species register at a much lower intensity for them. The psychologist said something I've thought about many times. The baseline state for humans who grew up on Earth is already adjusted for significant danger. When they encounter something that doesn't reach that threshold, they don't respond with fear. They respond with attention. Marin was paying attention to Karath, not because she was afraid, because she was curious. That, when I understood it, scared me more than anything Karath had done. Testimony TORRES, given name, RAFAEL human species, first-year student. Submitted voluntarily. Note, Tors requested that his full given name be included. I grew up in a city. Different kind of danger than Marin, but the principle applies. You learn early to read which situations are actually dangerous and which ones are. And I say this with no disrespect to Karath. Genuinely, it was a complicated situation, theater. What Karath was doing from where I was sitting was theater. I don't mean he wasn't serious about it or that the power he was describing wasn't real. I mean the presentation was theatrical. The posture, the explicit threats, the you should look afraid thing, that's a performance. That's someone enacting dominance, not someone who has decided to exercise it and is simply doing so. People who have actually decided to do something don't usually announce it. Marin understood that immediately. I could tell from how she responded. The okay thing, that was her recognizing the genre of the situation. It's like watching someone start to do a magic trick that you've already seen. You can see the mechanics and you relax. The thing I want people who weren't there to understand is that Marin's response wasn't aggressive. She wasn't threatening him back. She was just, and I've been trying to find the right word for this since it happened, she was just being honest with him. She was showing him an accurate picture, which, I think, ended up being genuinely frightening for him, because the picture he saw was different from the one he expected. He expected to be the most dangerous thing she'd encountered. He expected that to be established and legible. He expected fear. What he got was Marin essentially saying, I grew up on Earth. I've seen dangerous. You're interesting. And I think what scared him wasn't aggression or threat. It was the calm, the specificity, the way she talked about the cold and the dark and the predators with this kind of settled, matter-of-fact quality. Like she was describing the furniture in her apartment. Like these were not distant or abstract things to her. She wasn't performing bravery. That's what I want to be clear about. Performed bravery looks different. Performed bravery has tells. She wasn't performing anything. She was just there, in the room, being exactly what she was. And that, I don't have a better word for it, that hit him differently than any threat would have. Testimony, PRIYARAJNDRAN, Human Species, first-year student. Submitted voluntarily. I want to add something that I don't think the other testimonies fully capture. Marin has this quality, I guess. She's been like this since I've known her. She doesn't do things for effect. That sounds like a small thing, but it's actually rare. Most people, when they're in a conflict, are aware of how they look. They're managing the image. Marin genuinely doesn't seem to do that. What you see is just what she is in that moment. She comes from a fishing family, multi-generational. Her grandparents fished in the North Sea. The North Sea is, look, you can research it. There are specific kinds of danger involved in that kind of work that are very ancient and very basic. Cold water, unpredictable conditions, equipment that can kill you if you use it wrong. Her family has been doing that for, she said once in passing, centuries probably, though we stopped keeping track. She's not trying to be impressive when she talks about that. It's just where she's from. It's just what her people did. The thing that I think Karath encountered in that classroom was the full weight of that history. Not consciously. Not like she was wielding it deliberately. Just, it was in the room with her. The accumulated experience of a family, a people, a species that had been doing hard, dangerous things for a very long time and had not notably stopped. He threatened the wrong person, and I don't mean that in the sense that she was going to hurt him. I mean that he tried to establish dominance using fear as currency, and he found someone who just doesn't use that currency, who never needed to. I was trying not to laugh during her speech. I know that sounds terrible, but I've known Marin long enough to know that she would be embarrassed by how seriously everyone took it, and I was trying to hold that in. She found me afterward in the corridor and said, very quietly, "Was that too much?" I told her no. She seemed uncertain about that. Section 10. What the documentation systems captured. The Academic Council review of the incident included analysis of the classroom documentation feed, the standard environmental recording that runs continuously in all classrooms on Vareth 9. I obtained a copy of the relevant analysis through the IIP transparency protocols. I want to include the key findings here, because the behavioral analysis adds something to the eyewitness accounts. The analysis was conducted by the Council's Xenobehavioral Assessment Unit, which includes specialists in 7 species. Their report noted the following. First, Karath-7's aggression markers were consistent throughout the early part of the exchange. His display posture, chromatophore patterns, and vocal register all remained in the elevated range through his initial statements. Then, at the moment Marin smiled and said, "Okay," for the first time, Karath's measurable physiological indicators shifted. His crest retraction, the involuntary drop I noted, was accompanied by changes in his skin chromatophore patterns that the analysis identified as consistent with a rapid threat recalculation response. This is not a voluntary or consciously controlled response in Dramath. It's hardwired. It happens when a Dramath's nervous system abruptly reassesses a social situation. The report said, Subject Karath-7's nervous system responded to student Solstad's behavioral presentation as though encountering an unfamiliar and potentially higher status threat marker. This appears to have occurred not because student Solstad deployed any recognized threat display, but precisely because she did not. The absence of expected fear response, combined with the specific quality of the subject's continued calm engagement, appears to have triggered an unresolved threat classification loop in subject Karath-7's social processing. In simple terms, the system expected to encounter something it knew how to categorize. It did not. It escalated its assessment automatically. The report also noted, student Solstad's verbal delivery during her extended response showed no elevation in stress markers, no vocal tremor, no accelerated delivery, all of which would typically accompany public speaking in a confrontational context for humans according to our baseline data. Her delivery was, by human standards, below baseline stress. She appeared to be experiencing the situation as pleasantly engaging rather than threatening. This is consistent with documentation on humans from high-difficulty environments and suggests that student Solstad may have a significantly elevated stress threshold compared to consortium standard species. We recommend this data be included in the IIP orientation materials. Section 11, Karath-7's filed response. Karath-7 did not file a formal complaint. His family did contact the academic council through unofficial channels. I know this because it later came out in the disciplinary review. Karath did face review for his conduct, separately from the Marin situation, and the communications were entered into evidence. The contact from a family political representative requested that the IIP review Marin Solstad's disruptive behavioral presentation and her refusal to engage with standard social protocols. The council reviewed this request. Their response, which I also have a copy of through the transparency protocols, was admirably dry. Student Solstad's behavior, as documented, consisted of remaining seated, engaging in verbal dialogue, and providing contextual information about her species' evolutionary history. No recognized threat display, physical gesture of aggression, or protocol violation was identified. The council finds that student Solstad's conduct was within acceptable parameters for interspecies communication theory coursework, and arguably constituted a practical application of the course material. The council declines to pursue action against student Solstad. The council does note that student Karath-7's conduct, as documented, included explicit verbal threats against a fellow student's academic standing and against his species' consortium integration access. The council has initiated a separate review of this conduct. I will note, for completeness, that the separate review resulted in Karath-7 receiving a formal academic reprimand and being required to complete 20 hours of interspecies ethics training. His consortium council family connections were apparently not sufficient to prevent this outcome, which I think says something encouraging about the council's commitment to the program's principles. Karath 7 remained in the program for the rest of the year. He did not, to my knowledge, speak to Marin again. Section 12. The conversation I had with Marin. 3 days after the incident, I found myself walking to the observation deck at the same time as Marin. This happens sometimes on Vareth 9. The station's layout funnels people toward the observation corridors at certain hours, and you end up walking with whoever happens to be going the same direction. I wasn't sure whether to say anything. The incident had been discussed extensively among the student body. It had that quality that significant events acquire, where everyone processes it separately and then finds themselves needing to talk about it, compare versions, work out what it meant. I said, "Can I ask you something about what happened in the classroom?" She said, "Sure." I said, "When he said you should look afraid, what were you actually feeling?" She was quiet for a moment. We were walking through the outer corridor, where you can see the star through the environmental rated viewport, the dim, unhappy star that Vareth 9 orbits. It gives everything a particular quality of light, low and slightly orange, not quite warm. She said, "I was thinking about something my grandmother said once." I waited. We were out on the water. A storm came up faster than it was supposed to. We were too far out to get back easily, and the weather was, she paused, bad, genuinely bad. And I was young and I was scared, and I asked her if we were going to be okay. She said, and she looked at the water, at the storm, and she said, "The water doesn't care if we're scared, so we might as well not be." We kept walking. She said, I don't think she meant that fear was wrong. She meant that in that specific situation, fear was just information you didn't need. You already knew it was dangerous. You already knew what the danger was. What you needed was attention and skill. Fear wasn't adding anything to the equation. She said, when he was talking, I was just cataloging what he actually had, what he could actually do, what the realistic outcomes were. And when I finished the calculation, she made that small gesture again, the opening and closing with one hand. Fear didn't seem like the right response. I asked, "Were you not afraid at all?" She thought about this seriously. She considered it the way she did everything, like it deserved real attention. I was aware that the situation had some risk in it, she said. The things he was describing, the academic access stuff, the integration flags, those are real mechanisms. He was right about that. There was something real to navigate. She said, "But I've been in actual danger. Real, physical, this could kill you danger. Out on the water in bad weather with systems failing. And there's a texture to that, a quality of it, a specific feeling in your body." She said, "That wasn't it. That was a person who wanted me to feel small, using words he'd learned were effective. It's a different texture." She looked at the star through the viewport. "The problem," she said, and I heard something in her voice that was almost, not quite amused but adjacent to it, "is that what works to make people feel small is usually you showing that you're big. And to do that, you need them to perceive your size. You need them to measure themselves against you and come up short." She said he didn't understand that I wasn't measuring. We reached the observation deck. She went to the far window and stood there for a while, looking out at whatever Vareth 9 star system looks like from that angle. A small sad star and a few dead rocky planets, and a lot of very beautiful empty space. I stood at the other window and thought about what she'd said. After a while she said, without turning, "He's not a bad person. He's a product of a very specific social architecture that told him certain things about hierarchy, and he's been successful enough within that architecture that he never had reason to question it." She said, "I hope the ethics training is useful. I genuinely do." Then she said good night and left the observation deck. I stayed there for a while longer, watching the star. Section 13. Additional context: the Earth documentation files. Following the incident, several students, I was one of them, made requests to the Consortium Academic Library for expanded documentation on Earth and human evolutionary history. Our xenolinguistics program had standard materials, but several of us wanted to understand what Marin's description, the cold, the dark, the predators, the geological instability, actually meant in concrete terms. What we found was, I want to use the right word here, humbling. I had read the documentation summaries. I thought I understood what Earth was. A high-difficulty world, yes. A world with significant predatory pressure and challenging climate variation. I understood that intellectually. The detailed documentation is different from the summary. The detailed documentation includes things like the specific behavioral and physiological adaptations that humans developed over approximately 300,000 years of environmental pressure. The way their pain processing systems work, not less sensitive than other species, as we sometimes assume, but differently calibrated. Pain is information for humans. They process it as data rather than as stop signal in many documented cases. A Chelhari in significant pain stops. A human in significant pain very often continues what they're doing while simultaneously trying to address the pain source. The documentation includes the history of Earth's geological events, multiple mass extinctions, ice ages, the shifting of entire continents over the span of humanity's evolutionary history, reshaping the environments that were shaping them simultaneously. The species survived all of this not by finding stable ecological niches, but by generalizing, by becoming adaptable rather than specialized, by being able to learn and transmit learned information faster than evolution could have managed alone. The documentation includes a section on human concepts of danger that I found particularly striking. It notes that humans have many words for types of danger. An elaborate vocabulary for categorizing and discussing risk that linguistic analysts believe reflects genuine cognitive complexity around the concept. But the documentation also notes that humans are extensively documented to seek out danger voluntarily, to deliberately engineer scenarios of risk, what they call extreme sports or adventure activities, or sometimes simply fun, in the absence of actual threat. The analysis suggests that this is an artifact of evolutionary pressure. An organism that developed in constant danger over hundreds of thousands of years may develop psychological mechanisms that seek stimulation at the level that danger used to provide. When the danger decreases, because technology and civilization have reduced it, the psychological mechanism remains. It keeps looking. I thought about Marin in that classroom. The way she'd looked at Kareth 7 with that genuine, from the inside-out interest. And I thought, she wasn't performing calm. She found the situation genuinely interesting. Because interesting is what her nervous system calls things that reach the threshold her environment calibrated it to. Section 14. What it meant for the program. I want to talk about what happened afterward, not dramatically, not in terms of major events, but in terms of the texture of the program. How things felt different. The incident became something that people referred to obliquely, the classroom thing, that situation with Kareth. Students who hadn't been there heard about it from students who had, and there was inevitably distortion. The story got larger, more dramatic, as stories do. I've heard versions where Marin made explicit threats, where there was some kind of physical confrontation, where Kareth left the program entirely. None of that is true. What actually happened was much quieter, and I think that's why the story kept growing, because people sensed the size of what had happened even through the quiet surface of it, and tried to translate that size into the dramatic vocabulary they were familiar with. But the drama vocabulary wasn't quite the right tool. What actually happened was, a student from a species 11 years in the consortium looked at a student from a species 1100 years in the consortium and didn't flinch, didn't perform, didn't comply and didn't threaten, just held still, was exactly what she was. And that turned out to be significantly more than the other student had accounted for. The program changed afterward in small ways. The Dramath students, not just Kareth but others, seemed to recalibrate something, not in a dramatic way, but I noticed fewer of the low-grade status negotiations that had been a persistent texture of the first weeks. The probing comments, the careful contempt. They didn't stop entirely, but they became rarer, like something had been communicated that didn't need to be communicated again. The human students didn't change much from what I could see. Marin was still quiet. Tor still tried to mediate every conflict he encountered. Priya still wrote in 3 notebooks simultaneously. They were what they'd been. Maybe that was the point. Section 15. A note from Professor YMVATH. Submitted to the Archival Bureau at the Bureau's request. I was not present for the incident. I arrived immediately after, and I will be honest. I walked into a room that felt different from how I'd left it, and I didn't know why, and I adjusted my posture slightly and began setting up my materials and proceeded with the lecture. I have since watched the documentation, recording many times. I want to say something about the content of my lecture that day, because I find the coincidence, if it is a coincidence, meaningful. The lecture was on paralinguistic communication, specifically on the gap between what is said and what is communicated, the way that delivery, context, register, and a speaker's apparent internal state transmit information that is distinct from the semantic content of their words. My thesis in that lecture was that paralinguistic communication is often more powerful than linguistic content, that how you say something, what your body and your tone and your evident emotional state communicate, frequently overrides or reframes what the words themselves say. Student Solstad's conduct during the incident, which I was not present for, appears to be one of the more precise natural demonstrations of this principle that I have encountered in my teaching career. She did not say anything threatening. The semantic content of her words was, on analysis, entirely benign, biographical information, a few philosophical observations, a clear and uncomplicated statement that she was not afraid. What she communicated was something else entirely. What she communicated was something that I think operates below the level of language, below the level of species-specific signaling conventions. It was something that apparently translated across the Dramath/human communication gap without friction, without loss, without any of the usual noise that interspecies communication involves. I don't have a precise academic term for it. The closest I can get is, she communicated the truth of what she was, and the truth of what she was, a representative of a species that had been shaped by several 100,000 years of extraordinary difficulty into something genuinely, measurably, deeply capable, landed in that room with the full weight of what it was. Kareth 7 is a young Dramath student from a comfortable family in a long-established consortium species. He has lived in safety, in hierarchy, in a context that has been broadly predictable. His sense of scale is built on those experiences. He had no framework for what walked into his hierarchy that day, and looked at him with gray-green eyes and smiled. That's not a criticism of him. It's an observation about scale, about what happens when you apply measurements to something you haven't correctly measured before. I've taught interspecies communication for 30 years. And the lesson that I keep coming back to, the lesson that I think underlies all of our efforts to understand each other across the gaps between species, is this. Before you can communicate, you must first be willing to be surprised by what the other being actually is. Kareth 7 was not willing to be surprised. He had already decided what Marin Solstad was before she said a word. That was the error, not the arrogance, not the threats. Those were symptoms. The error was the certainty, the closed measurement. Marin, I think, had no fixed idea of what Kareth was before he spoke. She let him be what he was, cataloged it, and responded to what was actually there rather than to a prior assumption. She did, in a sense, demonstrate the curriculum, which I take some complicated professional satisfaction in, even under the circumstances. Section 16. Final Testimony, MARENSOLSTAD. Submitted at the Archival Bureau's direct request. Note in file, subject required significant persuasion to submit testimony. Quote from initial contact. I didn't do anything. Other people watched something happen and then described it. That's not the same as me doing something. Subject eventually agreed on condition that her testimony be included after all other accounts, so that she could read what others had said and respond to it, rather than describe events that others had already described. I've read the testimonies. I've read the behavioral analysis. I've read what Professor Yenvath wrote. I want to say something first. I'm uncomfortable with how large this has gotten. What happened was a student being unpleasant to me and me talking to him. That's a Tuesday. On Earth, in any school, in any city, in any cafeteria, that's a Tuesday. The part that I didn't expect, being honest, was how it registered to everyone watching. I genuinely did not understand in the moment that my being calm was communicating something. I thought I was just talking. I've learned since then that calm reads differently depending on where it comes from. If you're calm because you're suppressing fear, people notice. If you're calm because you've processed the situation and found it genuinely not frightening, people notice that differently. It apparently looks different from the outside. I've been told that what people saw was me being unafraid. What I was experiencing was, I tried to explain this to Drenak, and I'll try again here. I wasn't unafraid in the sense of having conquered fear. I was unafraid in the sense that what Kareth was doing didn't reach the level of things I associate with fear. He was using words. He was describing things he could potentially do, some of which were real threats and some of which were probably exaggerated. He was standing in a room and being big and loud and expecting those facts to function as weapons. That's not nothing. I want to be fair to him. The things he described could have real consequences. The academic flags, the access reviews, those are real mechanisms and they were real things to be concerned about. I wasn't dismissing them. But concern and fear are different. Concern means you take the thing seriously and figure out what to do about it. Fear means the thing has overwhelmed your ability to think about it. The things he described reached concern. They didn't reach fear. So I was concerned, and I was also, I'll use Tor's word, attending, paying attention, figuring out what was actually there as opposed to what was being performed. What was actually, there was a young person who had a specific understanding of power and hierarchy that had never been challenged in a way he couldn't manage, and who found my existence as an apparent non-participant in his hierarchy confusing and therefore threatening. That's a solvable problem. That's a communication situation. What was not there was anything that reached the level of, I used the word to Drenak, and I'll use it again, texture. The particular texture of real physical danger. I know that texture. I grew up with access to it. My grandmother died at sea. Not in the incident I described, a later one, a different storm when I was 14. They found the boat but not her. The North Sea is cold enough that if you go in and don't get out quickly, the cold decides for you. I know what real danger feels like when it's close. I know the specific quality of the air around it. Kareth 7 was not that. I'm not saying that to diminish him. I'm saying it to explain the calibration. I'm not brave in the sense of having overcome something. I'm adjusted, maybe, adjusted to a different scale. The thing I hope people take from this, if it's going to be archived and documented and read by people I'll never meet, it's not a human thing, or not only a human thing. Priya is braver than me in ways I could describe for pages. Tors walks into conflicts voluntarily and tries to fix them with his bare hands, which I find genuinely heroic and also mildly alarming. Sun Li does things that scare me and she does them laughing, which is, I don't have adequate words for what Sun Li is. It's about knowing what you are. It's about having a clear enough picture of what's actually in front of you to respond to that rather than to the fear of it. Kareth wanted me to respond to the fear of him, and I couldn't. I couldn't manufacture that fear because it didn't exist, so I responded to him. To what was actually there. What was actually there was complicated. Genuinely. A person with real capabilities and real history and a very specific blind spot about what certain things meant. That was worth engaging with. That was worth a real conversation. I hope, honestly, that the ethics training is useful. I hope he gets something from it. Not because of what he did to me. I've genuinely let that go. It was a Tuesday. But because the blind spot is going to keep causing him problems until he addresses it, and I'd rather he address it than not. One more thing. The smile. Several accounts mention the smile. I want to be clear about what that was, because I can tell from the testimonies that people have assigned it significance that I didn't consciously intend. I smiled because, when he said you should look afraid, what I felt was the very specific relief of a situation becoming clear, of ambiguity resolving. For the first weeks of the program, I hadn't known quite what to do with him, whether the comments were something I was misreading, whether I was applying the wrong framework, whether the right response was to try harder to engage or to create more distance. When he said that, in those words, I understood exactly what I was dealing with and exactly what was being asked of me, and the understanding felt good. Situations you can see clearly are easier to navigate than situations you can't. The smile was relief, genuine relief. I didn't know it would read the way it read. I can see why it did in retrospect. Someone in Kareth's position, from his background, with his frame of reference, someone expecting fear, would read that smile very differently than I meant it. I'm sorry a little that it frightened him. I genuinely am. That wasn't the goal. But I'm not sorry I had it. It was an honest reaction. And if there's one thing my grandmother taught me, it's this. In the water, in the dark, in the cold, honesty is what keeps you from making the wrong move. You can perform anything else. You cannot perform your way to the surface. I am from that water, from that dark, from that cold. That's not a threat, that's just what I am.